She held no public office, commanded no army, and her name was not stamped on a single product. Yet she was the silent empress of a multi-billion-dollar empire, a woman who dictated taste to a nation and wielded a power more absolute than that of any CEO or politician. The institutions she forged from nothing, New York Fashion Week, the Met Gala, the CFDA, became global phenomena, their glittering names so bright they cast their own creator into an almost complete shadow. Her name was Eleanor Lambert. How could the architect of an entire industry be so completely written out of its history, becoming a ghost in the very machine she designed? To understand the sheer scale of Eleanor Lambert's revolution, you must first transport yourself back to a world that is today almost impossible to imagine. A world where American fashion, as an idea, was not just secondary, it was non-existent. It was a contradiction in terms like artistic accounting or glamorous dentistry. In the early decades of the 20th century, America was a great gangly adolescent, rich, powerful, and bursting with energy, but utterly hopelessly insecure. It was a cultural colony of Europe, and in all matters of taste, style, and beauty, its colonial master was Paris. Paris was not just the leader. It was the sole undisputed and often cruel deity. Its great couture houses, Chanel, Vionnet, Lanvin, Patou, Schiaparelli, were the temples. The designers who ruled them were the high priests, issuing infallible decrees on everything from the height of a hemline to the angle of a hat. Their word was law. This system had been in place since the mid-19th century, when an Englishman named Charles Frederick Worth had effectively invented haute couture, transforming the humble dressmaker into a dictatorial artist, and his clients from patrons into disciples. Paris had the history. It had the ecosystem of unparalleled suppliers, the finest lace makers, feather workers, and embroiderers in the world, families who had passed their skills down for generations. It had the patronage of royalty and aristocracy. It had, in short, a monopoly on chic. For any American woman of means, and for the vast commercial industry that served her, the process of getting dressed was a ritual of biannual submission. Twice a year in late January and late July, a fleet of ocean liners, the Normandy, the Queen Mary, would steam east across the Atlantic. They were filled with the most powerful women in American retail, the buyers for Saks Fifth Avenue, Bergdorf Goodman, and Neiman Marcus, alongside the editors of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, and a select few of the nation's wealthiest private clients. This was the pilgrimage. Their arrival in Paris marked the beginning of a frantic, secretive, and deeply hierarchical scramble for access. The shows themselves were nothing like the stadium-sized spectacles of today. They were intimate, formal, and intensely intimidating affairs held in the gilded gray and white salons of the couture houses. Editors and buyers sat on fragile gilt chairs, clutching their notebooks in a state of hushed reverence. Sketching was verboten, a cardinal sin. The houses were terrified of their designs being copied and went to enormous lengths to protect their originals. Models, known as mannequins, would glide through the room, holding a numbered card. There was no music, just the whisper of silk on the carpet and the voice of the vendeuse, saleswoman, announcing the number and perhaps the name of the creation. Numero 23, Crepuscule. The editor's job was not to critique, it was to report. They were scribes, not critics. Their role was to dutifully record the pronouncements from on high. Schiaparelli shows a shorter skirt, Vionnet has perfected the bias cut, and transmit them back to an eager American public. The buyers, meanwhile, were engaged in a high-stakes commercial battle. They would place orders for gowns costing thousands of dollars, which they would then be given the right to import and reproduce back in the States. The most prestigious department stores would buy the original, which they would then sell to their wealthiest clients. But most would buy the toil, the muslin pattern of the garment, along with the license to copy it. The entire American garment industry on 7th Avenue in New York was essentially a massive legalized copying operation. An American designer was not an artist. He was a manufacturer. He was a tradesman, a skilled technician whose talent was judged by how faithfully he could reproduce a V&A shoulder or a Chanel jacket. What was American style before this? It was workwear, the denim overalls of farmers, the sturdy boots of factory workers. It was the mass-produced practical clothing sold through mail-order catalogs like Sears, Roebuck and Company, garments prized for their durability, not their beauty. Or it was the awkward, over-decorated, and poorly made copies of Paris gowns that adorned the wives of the newly rich. It was a world of commerce, not art. It was seen as provincial, derivative, and, worst of all, vulgar. There was no such thing as an American fashion star. There was no designer whose name on a label could confer prestige. The very concept was a joke. This was the world Eleanor Lambert surveyed, and she was not impressed. Eleanor Lambert's story does not begin in a swirl of silk and glamour, but in the flat, quiet, corn-growing country of western Indiana. She was born in 1903 in Crawfordsville, a town with a curious and formative secret. Despite its small size, it was a hub of startling intellectual and literary activity known as the Athens of Indiana. It was the home of several prominent authors and academics, including Lew Wallace, the author of Ben-Hur. Lambert did not grow up in a cultural vacuum. She grew up in an environment where ideas were taken seriously, where writing was a respected profession, and where a person from a small town could, through sheer force of intellect, command a national audience. She was not a child of privilege. Her family was educated but of modest means. Her father was a vaudeville booking agent who later worked for Barnum and Bailey. What she inherited was not wealth, but a restless, ferocious ambition and an ironclad self-belief. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she possessed a psychic energy that made her seem towering. She was, as she would later admit, born bossy. She studied art history, first at the John Herron School of Art in Indianapolis, and then, crucially, at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was here, surrounded by some of the greatest artworks in the world, that she began to formulate her life's philosophy. She saw that a masterpiece hanging in a dark, empty room was just a piece of painted canvas. It only became a masterpiece when it was lit correctly, when it was placed in the right gallery, when a critic wrote about it, and when the right people gathered to look at it. She realized that art was not just about creation, it was about presentation. It was about context. It was about publicity. She tried her hand at sculpture, but quickly and pragmatically assessed that her true talent lay elsewhere. She moved to New York in the mid-1920s, a young woman from the Midwest with no connections and no money, but with an absolute unshakable certainty in her own abilities. She tried to get a job at Harper's Bazaar and was told they didn't hire women who weren't from high society. It was a snub that would fuel her for decades. She talked her way into a job at an advertising agency, but her real calling was the still nascent, slightly disreputable field of public relations. Her first arena and her great training ground was not fashion, it was art. In the late 1920s and 1930s, the American art world was undergoing a revolution almost identical to the one she would later ignite in fashion. For decades, American art had been in the same subservient position as American clothing. The great art was European, the old masters, the French Impressionists. American painters were seen as provincial copyists. But now, a new muscular and uniquely American school of art was emerging. Painters like Thomas Hart Benton, Grant Wood, and John Stewart Curry were celebrated for their regionalism. In New York, artists were creating a bold urban vision that would eventually lead to abstract expressionism. Lambert plunged into this world. She became one of the first and certainly the greatest art publicists of her generation. She understood that to sell the art, you first had to sell the artist. You had to create a myth, a personality. She worked with sculptors like Jacob Epstein and Osamu Noguchi, and painters like Jackson Pollock and Alexander Calder. She learned how to take a difficult, challenging, avant-garde artist and build a compelling narrative around them. She would place stories in the papers, not just about their work, but about their lives, their struggles, their iconoclastic vision. She made them characters, she made them celebrities, but she didn't just promote individuals. She built the entire system. This is the key to understanding her genius. She was an institution builder. In 1934, she was instrumental in the founding of the Whitney Museum of American Art, the first museum dedicated solely to American artists. She helped Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the museum's founder, turn her private collection into a major public institution. Then she helped found the Art Dealers Association of America. She understood that for American art to be taken seriously, it needed the same infrastructure as its European counterparts, a major museum to consecrate it, and a professional guild to legitimize it and regulate its commerce. She was, in effect, building the cannons before she started the war. She was a master of the press, and her marriage to Seymour Bergson, a high-flying executive at Hearst Newspapers, gave her an unparalleled inside track. Their home was a salon for the most powerful journalists, editors, and publishers in New York. She didn't just pitch stories. She was part of the very fabric of the media world. She knew what editors wanted before they did. She knew how to frame a story, what to leak, and who to call. She was not just a publicist, she was a strategist, a confidant, and to many, an indispensable ally. By the late 1930s, Eleanor Lambert was a dominant force in the art world. But she was restless. She looked across the cultural landscape of New York and saw another industry, one far larger and wealthier than the art world, that was still trapped in a colonial mindset. That was the garment industry, centered on 7th Avenue. She saw a world of immense talent, filled with designers who were creating brilliant original work, but who were treated like anonymous tradesmen. There was Claire McCardell, a true American revolutionary, who was inventing sportswear by creating practical, elegant, and comfortable separates for the active American woman, clothes that had no Parisian antecedent. There was Norman Norell, a designer of such technical brilliance and sophistication that his gowns could rival any in Paris. But he was working as the in-house anonymous designer for a dress manufacturer. There was Hattie Carnegie, a brilliant designer and retailer who was nurturing a generation of new talent in her workshops. These people, Lambert realized, were artists, just like her painters and sculptors. But they had no platform. They were ghosts, their names unknown to the very public that wore their clothes. The magazines, when they even bothered to show American designs, would often credit the department store, not the designer. Lambert saw her opportunity. She would do for American designers exactly what she had done for American artists. She would take them from the trade pages and put them on the front pages. She would turn these anonymous craftsmen into public personalities. She would build the institutions that would give them credibility, honor, and a platform. She would, in short, launch a war of cultural independence. She founded her own agency, the Eleanor Lambert Company, and began to gather her army. She signed Norman Norell. She signed Claire McCardell. She began to represent the finest of the American designers, one by one. Her pitch was simple. I can make you a star. She began her campaign, a steady drumbeat of press releases, private luncheons for editors, and carefully placed stories. She was changing the language, insisting that journalists use the designers' names. She was building the narrative, piece by piece, the narrative of a new, vital, and uniquely American style, born not of Parisian fantasy, but of American reality. She was laying the groundwork, building her artillery, and preparing her lines. But she was still fighting against a system that was a century old. The snobbery of Paris was a mountain that seemed impossible to move. She needed something to shake the foundations of the world, a crisis so profound it would shatter the old order and give her a chance to build a new one. In May of 1940, that crisis arrived. The German army marched down the Champs-Élysées. Paris, the city of light, the undisputed goddess of fashion, fell. The borders were sealed. The transatlantic cables were cut, and the couture houses were shuttered. For the American fashion industry, it was a cataclysm. The source of all inspiration, all direction, all authority was suddenly and totally gone. The buyers, the editors, the manufacturers, they were lost, adrift in a terrifying new world without a map. In the fall of 1940, for the first time in history, the pilgrimage to Paris did not happen. The industry was in a state of blind panic. Eleanor Lambert was not. She knew with the clarity of a battlefield general that this was not a disaster. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. This was her moment. This was the declaration of independence she had been waiting for. With Paris silenced, she would finally make New York speak. The fall of Paris in 1940 was not a whisper. It was a sonic boom that shattered the very foundations of the fashion world. For the American industry, the buyers at Bergdorf's, the editors at Vogue, the manufacturers on 7th Avenue, it was a moment of sheer, blind panic. Their god had been taken captive. Their oracle was silenced. The biannual pilgrimage, the ritual that gave their entire commercial existence meaning, was canceled indefinitely. The industry was adrift in a terrifying new ocean with no map, no compass, and no stars to steer by. They were, for the first time in history, completely and totally on their own. But in her offices in Manhattan, Eleanor Lambert did not panic. She did not mourn. She mobilized. This was not a catastrophe. It was the opportunity she had been preparing for her entire professional life. It was a declaration of independence handed to her on a bloody silver platter by the German war machine. The mountain of Parisian snobbery had not been moved. It had been momentarily obliterated, leaving a vacuum of power. And Eleanor Lambert, a woman who abhorred a vacuum, was about to fill it. She was already perfectly positioned. In the late 1930s, the various entities of the New York garment industry, the manufacturers, the retailers, and the powerful International Ladies Garment Workers Union, had done something unprecedented. Worried about the looming threat of war and its potential effect on their business, they had banded together to form a promotional body. They called it the New York Dress Institute. Its goal was to promote the New York Creation label and to encourage American women to buy American-made clothes, a campaign of economic patriotism. It was a good idea, but it was being run by advertising men who, to the horror of high-end retailers, produced schmaltzy, flag-waving ads. The heads of stores like Lord & Taylor and Saks Fifth Avenue were appalled. They insisted that the Institute hire someone who understood elegance, not just commerce. They insisted on Eleanor Lambert. She took the job and immediately began her campaign, but she was still pushing against the tide of Paris. Now, with Paris gone, she had the full, terrified attention of the entire industry. Her plan, which she had been honing, was as simple as it was audacious. If the American press could no longer go to Paris to see the collections, she would bring the collections to them, all of them, in one place. She would create a centralized, organized, and highly curated event where all the top American designers, the ones she had been cultivating for years, could present their work to the nation's most important fashion editors. She would call it Press Week. Today, the idea of a fashion week seems elemental, as if it sprang from the earth fully formed. In 1943, it was considered a logistical nightmare, if not an impossibility. The designers Lambert wanted to showcase were not collaborators. They were bitter, cutthroat rivals. They were used to showing their collections in their own private showrooms, on their own schedules, to their own hand-picked lists of editors and buyers. The idea of sharing a stage, of being seen side by side with their direct competition, was horrifying. What if one designer's collection was clearly better? What if a journalist skipped their show to see another? They would be exposing themselves, making themselves vulnerable. Lambert, however, was, in her own words, a little bit of a bulldozer. She was a master of a particular kind of coercive charm. She went to each designer, to Norman Norell, the great perfectionist, to Claire McCardle, the sportswear revolutionary, to Hattie Carnegie, the grand dame of the custom trade, and she made her case. It was a case built on a brilliant mixture of flattery, patriotism, and stark commercial logic. This is your moment, she would argue, your patriotic duty. Are you going to let American fashion die because Paris is closed? Or are you going to step up and show the world what we can do? She flattered them, calling them the new leaders, the American originals, who no longer needed to hide behind Parisian labels. And she made the cold, hard point. The editors are lost. They need you to tell them what is new. If you all show together, you are not just a collection of dressmakers. You are a movement. You become a story too big for them to ignore. She was relentless. She was a whirlwind of phone calls, luncheons, and handwritten notes. She played their egos against one another. Norell is in. She might tell a wavering designer, "Do you really want to be the one who isn't there, the one who is left out?" One by one, they capitulated. They agreed nervously to participate in her great experiment. Her next battle was with the press. The top-tier editors in New York, women like Edna Woolman Chase at Vogue and Carmel Snow at Harper's Bazaar, were part of the old guard. They were in their hearts loyal to Paris. They viewed American design with a barely concealed snobbery. Even the formidable Diana Vreeland, then at Harper's Bazaar, had initially scoffed at Lambert's attempts to promote American designers, dismissing them as mere copyists. Lambert knew she needed more than just the New York elite, who were too jaded and too set in their ways. She needed a new audience, a fresh pair of eyes. So she went national. She compiled a list of newspapers from every major city in the country: Chicago, Dallas, San Francisco, St. Louis. But she faced a new problem. Most of these papers in 1943 did not have a dedicated fashion editor. The women who wrote about clothing also wrote about society, homemaking, and cooking. Fashion, especially American fashion, was not considered serious news. It was women's page fluff. Lambert didn't care. She sent them a personal engraved invitation to come to New York for a full week of events. And when the papers balked at the cost, this was wartime, and travel budgets were non-existent, she played her trump card. The New York Dress Institute, she announced, would pay for their travel and their hotel. It was a masterstroke. She was, in effect, bribing the nation's press to come and take her designers seriously. In July of 1943, a bewildered but intrigued group of around 50 female journalists, many of whom had never been to a professional fashion show in their lives, descended on New York. Lambert put them up at the Plaza Hotel, the chicest address in the city. She gave them a glamorous whirlwind itinerary of breakfasts, luncheons, and, of course, the shows themselves, which were also held at the Plaza. She didn't just give them access, she gave them the full red carpet movie star treatment. She made them feel, for the first time, that they were not just women's page writers. They were fashion critics, every bit as important as their counterparts in Paris. The event itself was a revelation. For the journalists who were used to seeing grainy photographs of Paris gowns, here was the clothing in living color on living models, and it was brilliant. It was not a pale imitation of Paris. It was something entirely new. It was Claire McCardle's revolutionary popover wrap dress, a practical, stylish, and comfortable garment that would become an American icon. It was Norman Norell's flawless tailoring, his sequined evening chemise dresses that were as glamorous as anything in France, but with a sleek, modern American ease. It was the invention of sportswear, of separates, of an entire wardrobe philosophy built for the active, pragmatic, and newly independent American woman who was now working in factories and running businesses while the men were at war. The reaction from the press was not just positive, it was rapturous. They had been treated like royalty. They had been given a new sense of professional purpose, and they had been handed a fantastic patriotic story. American genius shines while Paris is dark. They returned to their hometown papers and wrote glowing front-page stories about this new homegrown fashion. The coverage was a tsunami. Lambert had not just created an event, she had, as she'd done for her artists, created a narrative. She had successfully bypassed the skeptical New York old guard and taken her case directly to the rest of America. New York Fashion Week was born, and Eleanor Lambert was its undisputed iron-fisted and visionary mother. Press Week was a triumph, but Lambert knew it was only the first step. A marketplace was not enough. She had put American designers on the stage, but now she needed to put them on a pedestal. She knew from her time in the art world that for a creative field to be taken seriously, it needed a system of critical validation. It needed prizes. The film industry had the Oscars, literature had the Pulitzer, the theater had the Tony Awards. Fashion, she decided, needed its own. In 1943, the same year as the first Press Week, she created the Coty American Fashion Critics Award. The choice of sponsor was itself a stroke of genius. The Coty Fragrance Company was a French brand, but its American operations were huge. By linking her award to a name synonymous with Parisian luxury, she was subtly borrowing a sheen of international prestige. But the award itself was fiercely, proudly American. Its purpose was to recognize and encourage outstanding American design. Lambert, however, did not want to be the sole judge. That would be too obvious, too dictatorial. Her true genius was in creating systems that appeared to be objective democratic bodies, but which she, from behind the scenes, almost completely controlled. She created a jury of over 70 of the most powerful fashion editors in the country, the very women she had just cultivated so brilliantly during Press Week. They would be the ones to cast the ballots. The award itself was a small bronze statuette of a female figure, designed by the artist Malvina Hoffman. It was nicknamed the Winnie, and overnight, winning a Winnie became the single most important honor in American fashion. It was the Oscar, the Pulitzer, and the knighthood all rolled into one. When Norman Norell won the first award in 1943, it cemented his status as the Dean of American Designers. When Claire McCardle won, it was the ultimate validation of her revolutionary sportswear. Winning a Coty could make a career. It could take a young, unknown designer and make them a household name. It gave designers a new public status as artists. They were no longer just anonymous craftsmen. They were Coty Award winners, a title that was trumpeted in advertisements and newspaper columns across the country. For over 4 decades, Lambert administered the Coty Awards. She ran the jury, she tallied the votes, and she produced the lavish, star-studded awards ceremony, an event that became one of the hottest tickets in New York. And of course, she controlled the press. She ensured that the winners received a flood of fawning coverage. She was, in effect, the industry's headmistress, handing out the gold stars to the designers who best represented her vision of a sophisticated, modern, and powerful American fashion. The Coty Awards were the second pillar in her temple, the critical infrastructure that elevated a trade to an art form. Lambert now had a marketplace, Press Week, and a system of critical honor, the Coty Awards. But she was missing the third and perhaps most crucial piece. She understood a fundamental truth about fashion. It is not just about the clothes, and it is not just about the designers. It is about the women who wear them. She saw that society, celebrity, and style were an indivisible trinity. To make the designers legendary, she first had to anoint the women who wore them as goddesses. She needed a way to link her American designers to the most glamorous, most talked about, and most admired women in the world. So in 1940, even before the first Press Week, she had launched her most controversial, elitist, and most brilliantly effective weapon, the International Best Dressed List. The idea was not entirely original. There had been lists in Paris before the war. But Lambert, as always, perfected and weaponized the concept. The timing, once again, was key. With Paris occupied, the old arbiters of taste, the French duchesses and viscountesses, were irrelevant. Lambert's list was a new Bible for a new world, and it was one that would be written, edited, and published from New York. Its genius lay in its carefully constructed illusion of objectivity. The list, Lambert announced, was not her personal opinion. It was the result of a secret ballot, a poll of thousands of industry experts, designers, editors, retailers, and society figures. In reality, while she did send out ballots, the final list was pure, undiluted Eleanor. She counted the votes and then, as one observer noted, she did whatever she damn well pleased. She was the gatekeeper, the sole arbiter. She had the final, absolute, and terrifying say. To be named to the list was the ultimate social validation. It was more important than having a title, more significant than being born to the right family. It was a declaration that you had style, a quality that was now, thanks to Lambert, seen as the highest of all social virtues. And what was this style? It was a celebration of a new kind of woman, the American swan, as Truman Capote would later call them. These were women like Babe Paley, the wife of CBS founder William S. Paley. She was the epitome of a new, effortless American chic, a woman who famously tied a scarf to her handbag and, in that single gesture, created a global trend. She was named to the list 14 times, more than anyone else, before being elevated to the Hall of Fame, another Lambert invention to keep the list fresh and make room for new faces. The list celebrated women like Millicent Rogers, the rebellious Standard Oil heiress whose dramatic bohemian style and love of southwestern turquoise jewelry made her a fashion icon. It included Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor, a woman who was an international outcast for her role in the abdication crisis, but whose severe high-fashion elegance, Lambert insisted, was undeniable. It was a world of immense wealth of couture fittings and of lives lived in the public eye. Lambert's strategy was brilliant. She would place a woman like Babe Paley on the list, The press would then hysterically cover not just Babe Paley, but what she was wearing. And what was she wearing? Increasingly, it was the very American designers Lambert was promoting. The list created a perfect closed ecosystem of influence. 1. Lambert promotes the designer and gets him a Coty Award. 2. A great socialite wears the designer's clothes. 3. Lambert places the socialite on the best-dressed list. 4. The press covers the list, features the socialite, and mentions the designer. 5. The public, aspiring to be like the socialite, rushes to buy the designer's clothes. It was a machine, and Eleanor was the ghost in it. She had created a velvet rope, and in doing so, had made herself the most powerful woman in New York. She was the bouncer at the door of American high society, deciding who was in and who was out. The list, of course, was criticized for being elitist, for being snobbish, for celebrating a world of idle, wealthy, and almost exclusively white women. But that was precisely the point. Lambert understood that fashion to be desirable must be aspirational. It must be exclusive. She wasn't selling democracy. She was selling a dream. And for the next 60 years, she would be the dream's chief architect. By the early 1950s, the three great pillars of her empire were in place. The war was over, Paris was free, and haute couture, under the leadership of Christian Dior's new look, had come roaring back. But it no longer held its old monopoly. New York was now a rival, a true second capital, with its own stars, its own honors, and its own powerful high priestess. Eleanor Lambert had won her war. She was at the apex of her power, the undisputed empress of 7th Avenue. And it was then, at the very height of her public triumph, that her private world collapsed. By the middle of the 1950s, the war was won. Not just the Second World War, but Eleanor Lambert's private war for American cultural independence. She was no longer a scrappy publicist from Indiana. She was the undisputed and often feared empress of a global industry she had largely willed into existence. She was the matriarch, the prime minister, and the chief executioner of American fashion. Her three great institutions formed an iron triangle of power, a fortress of influence that she alone patrolled. Press Week, her first great invention, had evolved from a wartime emergency measure into a permanent semi-annual institution. It was the central marketplace, the engine of American commerce. The Coty Awards were the industry's high court, the place where she, through her carefully selected jury, issued the definitive judgments on who was a true artist and who was a mere tradesman. And the International Best Dressed list was her Bible, the sacred text that defined social aspiration for an entire generation, a velvet rope that she would personally raise or lower for the chosen few. She was, as one historian would later note, a factor in the gross domestic product of the U.S. Think about that. Not a designer, not a retailer, but a publicist, a woman whose only product was influence, was a recognized force in the American economy. She was at the zenith of her power, a sun queen around whom the entire solar system of American style revolved. And it was at this moment, at the absolute peak of her public triumph, that her private world, the carefully concealed scaffolding that held the empress upright, was about to be shattered by a single devastating blow. To understand the woman who emerged from that tragedy, you must first understand the formidable public armor she had built for herself, piece by painstaking piece. Who was this woman who commanded such absolute authority? To the world, Eleanor Lambert was not a person so much as an institution, an impression. And that impression was meticulously crafted. She was first and foremost tiny, a small bird-like woman who, through sheer force of will, took up all the oxygen in any room she entered. She was, by her own gleeful admission, born bossy, and she had weaponized that bossiness into a formidable tool of state. Her public look was a uniform, a deliberate piece of personal branding, as potent as Chanel's tweed suits or Schiaparelli's surrealist buttons. The most famous element, of course, was the turban. In the 1940s, she had adopted the style, and she would almost never be seen in public without one for the next 60 years. It was a stroke of branding genius. In a crowded room of society, women in their polite feathered hats, Lambert's turban was a beacon. It was exotic, artistic, and slightly imperious. It made her instantly recognizable, but it was also practical. It was armor. It was a way to have a finished look without surrendering to the fussy, ever-changing whims of millinery. It was a sign that she was not a follower of fashion. She was a worker. She didn't have time to set her hair. She had an empire to run. Paired with the turban was her jewelry. It was always big. It was always bold. It was often tribal, sculptural, and vaguely exotic. She wore great cuffs of ivory, necklaces of amber beads the size of golf balls, and enormous architectural brooches. This was not the delicate, good taste diamond and pearl jewelry of the society swans she promoted. This was a statement of power. It was the jewelry of a high priestess, a shaman. It was like her turbans, a form of costume, a way to project an aura of artistic authority and unassailable confidence. Her final accessory was her ever-present notebook. She was a woman of lists. She went everywhere with a notebook and pen, famously jotting down observations, names, and, of course, making the list. The image was complete: the turban of the oracle, the jewelry of the shaman, and the notebook of the judge. Her personality was the engine that made the armor work. She was famously, legendarily tough. She was a relentless, remorseless worker in an age when most women of her social standing were expected to do little more than host luncheons. She was on the phone from the moment she woke up. Her office was a whirlwind of activity, a command center where she dictated to a flurry of secretaries, arranged lunches, and, most importantly, worked the press. Her relationship with the media, cultivated over decades, was her true source of power. She didn't just pitch stories, she was the story. She understood that editors were lazy and overworked, so she did their jobs for them. She didn't just send a press release, she sent a fully formed column written in a witty, engaging style that an editor could drop directly onto the page. She cultivated journalists, editors, and publishers with the meticulous care of a master gardener. She knew their deadlines, their rivalries, their vanities. She knew who needed a hot piece of gossip for their column and who needed a thoughtful, long-form piece on a new designer. She was the ultimate information broker. She was a holy terror to those who crossed her, a bulldozer to those who stood in her way. But she was an indispensable ally to those who played her game. She could be witty, charming, and devastatingly persuasive. But beneath the charm was a core of pure, unadulterated Indiana steel. She was a pragmatist. She was not in the business of art or even of beauty, really. She was in the business of power, and her business was booming. This formidable public machine was, however, half of a partnership. In 1936, Eleanor had married her second husband, Seymour Berkson. This was not just a marriage, it was a merger. If Eleanor was the empress of fashion, Seymour was a prince of the press. He was a brilliant, hard-driving newspaper man, a top executive at William Randolph Hearst's powerful media empire. He was the publisher of the New York Journal American, one of the most influential papers in the country. Theirs was a true power couple, a full generation before the term was coined. Their apartment on Park Avenue was a salon, a crossroads, where the worlds of fashion, art, politics, and journalism collided. A dinner party at the Bergsons might include a senator, a surrealist painter, a Broadway star, and the editor-in-chief of Vogue. For Eleanor, this marriage was her secret weapon. She had an unparalleled 24-hour-a-day inside track on the very industry she was trying to manipulate. She understood the inner workings of the press, the rivalries between publishers, the mechanics of a news cycle, because she was married to a man who lived at the very center of it. Seymour was her partner, her confidant, and her most trusted advisor. He was the one person who saw the woman behind the turban, the strategist behind the bulldozer. Together they had one child, a son named Bill Bergson, born in 1939. He was the center of their private world, the heir to this joint empire of influence. For nearly 23 years, Eleanor and Seymour operated as a single unit, their professional and private lives completely intertwined. She was at the absolute height of her career, a woman in her mid-50s who was universally acknowledged as the most powerful woman in her field. She was, by any measure, invincible. And then, the floor of her world simply dropped away. On January 5, 1959, Seymour Bergson was in his office at the Journal American when he suffered a massive heart attack. He died almost instantly. He was 53 years old. For Eleanor, the news was not just a tragedy, it was an amputation. The man who had been her partner, her sounding board, and the quiet anchor of her chaotic life was gone. The blow was devastating. Friends and associates who had only ever seen the formidable, unsinkable Eleanor Lambert were stunned to see a woman completely undone by grief. She fell into a deep, debilitating depression. This woman who ran the lives of hundreds of others, who dictated the tastes of a nation, could barely function. She was 55 years old, a widow. In the social ecosystem of the 1950s, this was a perilous position. A woman's power, even a woman as accomplished as Eleanor, was still seen as intrinsically linked to her husband's. She had lost not just her husband, but her primary business partner and her greatest protector. The Empress was, for the first time in her life, vulnerable. She was faced with a choice. She could retreat, as many women of her time and class would have done. She could have retired to her grand apartment, living off her husband's estate, and become a distinguished widow, perhaps doing a bit of quiet charity work. The empire she had built could have been allowed to crumble, its institutions taken over by the committees and councils she had founded. But Eleanor Lambert was not built to retreat. After a period of profound and private grief, she made a different choice. She did what she had always done. She went back to work. But the woman who returned was different. The armor was still there, the turbans, the jewelry, the lists, but it was no longer just a uniform. It was a fortress. Work was no longer just her passion. It was her salvation. It was the one part of her life she could and would control absolutely. She poured all of her ferocious energy, all of her grief, all of her intellect into her empire. If she had been a bulldozer before, she was now a tank. She became even more relentless, even more demanding, even more completely and totally dedicated to the cause of American fashion. Her personal life had been shattered by a fate she couldn't control. She would ensure her professional life was an impregnable fortress that no one and nothing could ever touch. This tragedy forged the final indomitable version of Eleanor Lambert, the woman who would rule the industry for another 40 years. There was one other living, breathing part of her private life that existed in stark, almost beautiful contradiction to the public empress, her son, Bill Bergson. As Bill grew into a young man, it became clear he had no interest in his mother's world of society, commerce, and glamour. He was not going to be a fashion executive or newspaperman, like his father. He was a poet, and he was not just any poet. Bill Berkson became a core celebrated figure of the New York school, the avant-garde literary movement centered in Greenwich Village. His friends and collaborators were men like Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, and Kenneth Koch. This was a world of experimental verse, of abstract art, of jazz, and of a bohemian intellectual lifestyle that was the absolute antithesis of his mother's Park Avenue establishment world. Think about this contrast. On any given night, Eleanor Lambert, the high priestess of the uptown establishment, would be at a lavish ball at the plaza, wearing a turban and diamonds, deciding whether Babe Paley's gown was correct. At that very same moment, her son Bill would be downtown in a smoky sixth-floor walk-up apartment, drinking cheap wine, arguing about French symbolism, and reading poems that broke every conceivable rule of grammar and taste. This is perhaps the most humanizing and complex part of Eleanor's entire story. It reveals the woman beneath the armor. She, the ultimate pragmatist, the champion of commerce, the woman who had turned American art into a commodity, had raised and supported a son who was dedicated to the pure, non-commercial, and often impenetrable life of the mind. She did not disown him. She did not cut him off. By all accounts, she was immensely, if somewhat bewilderingly, proud of him. She supported him financially and emotionally. It proves that her first love, the art world, was not just a training ground. Her appreciation for art was genuine. She, the woman who had represented Jackson Pollock, understood the artistic temperament. She understood that her son's work, while it would never make him rich or land him on the best-dressed list, had its own kind of value. This contradiction is the key to her character. She was a woman who could genuinely admire a piece of avant-garde sculpture in the afternoon, and then go to her office and ruthlessly plot how to make a debutante the most famous woman in America by the evening. She was a pragmatist, but she was a pragmatist with a poet's son. It was this hidden intellectual depth that separated her from the very socialites she promoted. They were the product. She was the producer, the intellectual, the architect. This fierce, protective love for her son, combined with the new hardened shell she had built around herself after her husband's death, created the woman who would face the greatest challenge of her career. The 1950s, her golden age of uptown elegance, was coming to a close. A new decade was dawning, a decade of rebellion, of youth, and of a new kind of style that was bubbling up not from the couture salons, but from the streets. The 1960s were coming, and the youthquake was about to shake Eleanor Lambert's carefully constructed fortress to its very foundations, putting her and her entire establishment on the defensive for the first time in her life. When Seymour Berkson died in 1959, the woman who emerged from the ashes of that personal tragedy was not a widow in the traditional sense. She was a monarch in full battle armor. Eleanor Lambert, now in her late 50s, had lost her partner and her greatest confidant. In response, she fused herself completely with her work. Her public persona, the formidable turban-wearing, list-making empress, ceased to be a role she played. It became the entirety of her being. Work was her salvation, her fortress, and her only truly controllable reality. She had spent 3 decades building an empire. Now she would rule it, alone. And her rule, in the opening years of the 1960s, was absolute. The world of fashion was her world. It was a world of uptown elegance, of correctness. It was a world that revolved around her international best-dressed list, a sacred document that consecrated the high society swans as the arbiters of taste, women like Babe Paley, Gloria Guinness, and C.Z. Guest. These were her goddesses. They were mature women defined by their wealth, their marriages to powerful men, and their flawless, cultivated, and deeply expensive good taste. They were walking advertisements for the designers she championed, the sophisticated couture-level creations of Norman Norell, the aristocratic glamour of Oscar de la Renta, the polished daywear of Bill Blass. This was the establishment. It was a closed, perfect hierarchical system, and Eleanor Lambert sat at its apex. She was the one who anointed the designers at the Coty Awards. She was the one who consecrated the socialites with the best-dressed list, and she was the one who packaged it all for the press, who dutifully reported her every pronouncement. Her fortress seemed impregnable. But beyond the velvet ropes of Park Avenue and the polished floors of the Plaza Hotel, a revolution was brewing. It was a revolution of youth, of music, of class, and of a new, raw, chaotic energy that was about to take a sledgehammer to the very foundations of her elegant world. The 1960s were coming, and they were not asking for permission to enter. The first tremor didn't come from New York, and it certainly didn't come from Paris. It came from the bomb sites and art colleges of post-war London. A new generation was rising, the first in history that did not want to dress like its parents. On the contrary, they wanted to look like nothing their parents could even comprehend. They were fueled by a new rebellious sound, the sound of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They were creating their own clothes, their own rules, their own scene. On Carnaby Street and the King's Road, small subversive boutiques were opening. The most important was Bazaar, opened by a young, eccentric designer named Mary Quant. She was not a couturier. She was a member of the scene, designing for her friends. She was designing for a new kind of girl, a girl who had her own job, who took the new contraceptive pill, and who did not get her validation from high society matrons. This girl wanted to run, to dance, to live. And so Quant did something simple and explosive. She raised the hemline, and then she raised it again and again. The miniskirt was born. It was not just a dress. It was a social, political, and generational declaration of war. This new London look was a direct assault on everything Lambert's establishment held dear. It wasn't about elegance. It was about energy. It wasn't about correctness. It was about sex. It wasn't about good taste. It was about right now. And its icons were not the wives of billionaires. They were new minted celebrities from working class backgrounds. The model was no longer a remote aristocratic mannequin. She was a personality. She was Jean Shrimpton, with her long, gangly limbs and wide, innocent eyes. And soon she would be replaced by an even more radical figure, a skinny 16-year-old from a London suburb with a boyish haircut, enormous painted-on eyelashes, and a nickname, Twiggy. This was the youthquake, a term coined by the one woman in the establishment who saw it coming, and instead of running from it, decided to ride it like a tidal wave. That woman was Diana Vreeland. If Eleanor Lambert was the architect of American fashion, Diana Vreeland was its oracle. Their relationship was one of the great defining rivalries of the 20th century. It was a clash of titans, a battle of two completely different philosophies of power. Lambert was the pragmatist, the institution builder, the producer. She was the Midwestern girl who had built an industry. Vreeland was the fantasist, the iconoclast, the director. She was a Paris-born society figure who believed fashion was not a business, but a form of theater, a dream. Lambert was interested in power. Vreeland was interested in pizzazz. For years, they had coexisted in a delicate balance. Lambert, the publicist, needed Vreeland, the editor at Harper's Bazaar, to publish her designers. Vreeland needed Lambert to feed her new talent, and give her access to the great society swans. They were colleagues, allies, and in private, deeply suspicious rivals. Lambert respected Vreeland's theatricality but thought her a bit of a nut. Vreeland admired Lambert's efficiency but thought her hopelessly bourgeois and commercial. In 1963, this delicate balance of power exploded. Vreeland, in a high-profile move, left Harper's Bazaar and was installed as the new editor-in-chief of Vogue, the most powerful fashion magazine in the world. And from this new throne, Vreeland did not just report on the youthquake, she imported it. She embraced the chaos. She put Twiggy on the cover. She championed the kooky, the new, the street. She filled the pages of Vogue with images of rebellious youth, of pop art, and of a raw, unconventional beauty that was a direct affront to the polished good taste of Lambert's best-dressed list. This was a declaration of war. Lambert's entire empire was built on a top-down model. She and her committee of swans and designers would tell the public what was beautiful. Vreeland, with the massive platform of Vogue, was now championing a bottom-up model where style was bubbling up from the streets, from the clubs, from the kids. It was a fundamental crisis of authority. Lambert's list was still anointing Babe Paley, while Vreeland's Vogue was celebrating Andy Warhol's superstar, Edie Sedgwick. Lambert's world was about maturity, wealth, and order. Vreeland's was about youth, rebellion, and pizzazz. The 1960s, for Eleanor Lambert, became a long, grueling battle fought on two fronts. From the outside, she was under attack from a new generation that found her and her entire uptown world to be hopelessly square, irrelevant, and part of the establishment they were trying to tear down. And from the inside, she was being outflanked by her great rival, Diana Vreeland, who had hijacked the establishment's most powerful megaphone and was gleefully broadcasting the revolution. The American designers she had championed were also in crisis. A man like Norman Norell, the dean of American fashion, simply could not design a miniskirt. It was anathema to his couture-level sensibility. A new generation of American designers was bubbling up, ones who had no interest in the Coty Awards or the best-dressed list. Designers like Rudy Gernreich, a radical visionary from California, who created the monokini, the topless bathing suit, a garment designed more as a political statement than as actual clothing, or Betsy Johnson, who was creating wild, plastic, do-it-yourself fashion for the club kids. This was a world Lambert did not understand, and, what's more, she did not approve of it. For the first time in her career, the woman who had always been 5 steps ahead of the curve was in danger of being left behind. So, what does a 60-year-old empress do when her empire is under siege from a barbarian horde of teenagers? If she were a lesser woman, she would have retreated. She would have become a caricature, a bitter old woman complaining that nothing was elegant anymore. She would have become irrelevant. But Eleanor Lambert was not a lesser woman. She was a general, and she responded not by retreating, but by regrouping, adapting, and most importantly, building higher, stronger walls. She was a pragmatist. She knew she couldn't stop the youthquake. She couldn't ignore Diana Vreeland, and she couldn't pretend that Halston, the new American star, wasn't spending his nights at Studio 54. So she adapted her strategy. If the world was changing, she would not fight the change. She would institutionalize it. Her most brilliant and lasting countermove came in 1962, right at the beginning of the chaos. She recognized that her personal dictatorial control over the industry was being threatened by the new democratic street culture. Her personal taste was becoming a liability. So she did something genius. She transferred her power from a person to an institution. She founded the Council of Fashion Designers of America. On the surface, it was a noble and democratic act. It was a guild, a professional organization, modeled on the Art Dealers Association she had founded 30 years earlier. It would bring all the American designers together under one roof to protect their interests, to lobby the government, and to further the position of fashion as a branch of American art and culture. But beneath the surface, it was a classic Lambert power play. She was the one who wrote the charter. She was the one who handpicked the founding members. And she was the one who would run it under the title of executive director for the next several decades. The CFDA was her new fortress. It was a way to maintain control by giving the appearance of ceding it. She was no longer a dictator. She was the founder of the Constitution. It was a way to absorb the new generation of designers. By inviting a young, hot designer into the CFDA, she was, in effect, bringing them into her system. She was co-opting the rebellion. The CFDA ensured that even if her personal taste was challenged, her institutional power remained unassailable. She also adapted her public-facing institutions. The Coty Awards, which had been her baby, were starting to look a little dusty next to the wild energy of Vreeland's Vogue. The best-dressed list, with its endless parade of the same 10 socialites, was being mocked as out of touch. So Lambert, ever the pragmatist, began to let the new world in, just a crack. She started to allow new names onto the list: movie stars, artists, and even the occasional very chic musician. She began to champion the bridge designers, the ones who could span the gap between her uptown world and the new downtown scene. Her greatest finds in this era were 3 men who would define the next 20 years of American fashion: Bill Blass, Oscar de la Renta, and Halston. Blass and de la Renta were perfect. They had the charm and social graces of the old world, but they were designing a new kind of luxurious, modern, and incredibly wearable ready-to-wear. They were giving the swans what they wanted, but with a new, sportier American ease. Halston was her true masterstroke. Here was a man who was the perfect synthesis of the two worlds. He had the impeccable uptown credentials. He had started as the head milliner at Bergdorf Goodman. He had designed the iconic pillbox hat that Jackie Kennedy wore to her husband's inauguration. He was a Coty Award winner, but he was also a creature of the night. He was a star designer, a personality in his own right who was as famous as his clients. He was hanging out with Liza Minnelli and Andy Warhol at Studio 54. He was designing sleek, sexy, bias-cut jersey dresses that were made for the disco floor. In championing Halston, Lambert proved she could still pick a winner. She was co-opting the new glamour, sanctioning it, and bringing it into her fold. And then there was the Met Gala. This, more than anything, tells the story of her complex relationship with Diana Vreeland. Lambert had been involved with the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art since its inception. She had helped found it and had been running its annual fundraiser since 1948. It was, under her guidance, a respectable, quiet, uptown society benefit. But in 1972, Diana Vreeland, having been fired from Vogue, was looking for a new stage. She was installed as a special consultant to the Costume Institute. A lesser woman than Lambert would have seen this as an invasion and fought it to the death. But Lambert was a pragmatist. She saw an opportunity. She would keep control of the fundraising, the guest list, the power. Vreeland could have the fantasy. She could handle the theme, the exhibition, the pizzazz. Together, this odd couple, this clash of titans, created the template for the Met Gala we know today. Lambert provided the steel infrastructure of society and commerce, and Vreeland draped it in fabulous theatrical silks. It was the ultimate synthesis of their two opposing worldviews. By the early 1970s, Eleanor Lambert had weathered the storm. She was approaching her 70th birthday, and she was, if anything, more powerful than ever. The youthquake had faded. The hippies were cutting their hair. The establishment she had founded with its new CFDA wing had survived. American fashion was no longer just sportswear. It was the global billion-dollar designer ready-to-wear of Blas de la Renta and Halston. It was a commercial juggernaut. But one thing still stuck in her craw. One thing was left unfinished. Paris. For all her success, the old world snobbery remained. Yes, New York was the capital of commerce, but Paris was still and would always be the capital of art. The French, led by the undeniable celestial genius of Yves Saint Laurent, still looked down on their American counterparts as mere dressmakers, as tradesmen who designed sportswear. They were the couturiers, the artists. The Americans were the manufacturers. This was the last final insult that Eleanor could not abide. She had spent her entire life fighting to prove that American designers were artists, the equals of her painters and sculptors. She had won the war for commerce, but she had not yet won the war for prestige. She needed a final public, definitive showdown. She needed to take her American tradesmen and put them on a stage next to the French gods and prove, once and for all, whose vision was more powerful. The opportunity came, as it so often did, in the form of a crisis. The magnificent palace of Versailles, the very symbol of French glory and power, was crumbling. Its curator, Gerald van der Kemp, was trying to raise the modern equivalent of $60 million for its restoration. His American wife, Florence, had an idea. They would host a grand fundraiser, a ball, and tap into the vast reserves of American wealth. Elegant Lambert heard of this, and her strategic mind saw the opening. This would not just be a ball. This would not just be a fundraiser. She went to the organizers with a counter-proposal. It would be a show, a grand fashion spectacle. And it would not just be the French. It would be a friendly competition. The 5 greatest designers in France versus the 5 greatest designers in America. The French, with their characteristic self-assurance, found the idea charmingly quaint. A competition? How droll. Of course they agreed. It would be a delightful, fashionable execution. They would put on a grand, historic pageant, and their little American friends would show their nice little sports clothes. It would be a lovely footnote to the main event. They had no idea what they were agreeing to. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. Eleanor Lambert was about to set the stage for the most famous, most important, and most revolutionary fashion show in history. She was taking her army into the enemy's stronghold for one last battle. By 1973, Eleanor Lambert was 70 years old. She was, by any measure, the dowager empress of a global empire she had built from scratch. Her institutions were the law of the land. The CFDA was the industry's government, the Capote Awards its Supreme Court, and the best-dressed list its social Bible. She had weathered the youthquake of the 1960s, she had outmaneuvered her great rival Diana Vreeland, and she had successfully brought the new generation of American star designers, Blas, de la Renta, and Halston, into her establishment. She had won every conceivable war, except the first one. In the back of her mind, in the deep original heart of her ambition, one final fortress remained untaken. One last, stubborn, condescending enemy still refused to acknowledge her victory. That was Paris. For all of her success, for all the billions of dollars the American industry now generated, the old world order still held. In the gilded salons of the Rue Saint-Honoré and the hallowed halls of Vogue Paris, the consensus was firm. New York was the capital of commerce, of ready-to-wear, of sportswear. But Paris, and Paris alone, was the capital of art. The French had haute couture. They had genius. They had history. The Americans, they sniffed, were just very, very good tradesmen. They were dressmakers. This was the one insult Eleanor Lambert could not and would not abide. It was the original slight, the foundational snobbery she had set out to destroy 40 years earlier. She had spent her entire career arguing that her designers were artists, the equals of her painters and sculptors. She had won the war for commerce, but she had not yet won the war for prestige. She needed a final public definitive showdown, a duel. She needed to take her American tradesmen and put them on a stage side by side with the French gods in the enemy's most sacred sanctuary. She needed to prove, once and for all, whose vision was more powerful, whose art was more vital, and who truly owned the future. The opportunity, as it so often did for Lambert, arose from a crisis. The magnificent, sprawling, impossibly opulent palace of Versailles, the very symbol of French glory and the monument to its last great sun king, was crumbling. The roofs leaked. The paint was peeling. The stone was water damaged. The French government, in the midst of an economic downturn, did not have the funds for its restoration. The palace's brilliant, high-strung, and relentlessly ambitious curator, Gerald van der Kemp, was on a desperate global mission to raise the $60 million needed to save his beloved chateau. His American-born wife, Florence, suggested they tap into the vast reserves of American wealth. The idea was floated for a grand ball, a fundraiser to bring the richest of the rich to the palace. But when Eleanor Lambert heard of this, her strategic mind, even at 70, went into overdrive. This would not be a ball. This would not be a simple fundraiser. This, she proposed, would be an event. She got in touch with her friend, the Baroness Marie-Helene de Rothschild, the ultimate society hostess, and the queen of the Parisian jet set together. Lambert and the Baroness, with van der Kemp's eager blessing, forged a new concept. It would be a grand fashion spectacle, a glittering gala held in the palace's exquisite, newly restored Royal Opera Theatre. And to give it a frisson of excitement, a friendly competition, they would pit the 5 greatest living designers of France against 5 of the top designers from America. The French, with their characteristic self-assurance, found the idea charmingly quaint. A battle? How droll. Of course they agreed. It would be a delightful, fashionable execution. They would put on a grand historic pageant of haute couture, and their little American friends could show their nice little sports clothes. It would be a lovely opening act. They had no idea what they were agreeing to. They had no idea they were walking into the most precisely set ambush of Eleanor Lambert's entire career. The stage was set. The date was November 28, 1973. The teams were chosen, and the mismatch on paper was staggering. On the French side were the gods, the 5 living masters of haute couture, and the undisputed kings of the world. Their ranks included the reigning genius Yves Saint Laurent, the man who had inherited the mantle of Dior and then revolutionized fashion with his Le Smoking Tuxedo. Alongside him was the aristocrat Hubert de Givenchy, the master of pure, refined elegance, who had created the entire visual identity of Audrey Hepburn. They were joined by the futurist Pierre Cardin, an avant-garde sculptor of cloth, whose creations were pure theatrical fantasy, the fiery Emmanuel Ungaro, known for his sexy, draped, and incredibly complex designs. And completing this pantheon was Marc Bohan for Christian Dior, the quiet classicist upholding the most famous couture name in the world. This team represented history. They had government backing, the reverence of the global press, and the entire ecosystem of the Parisian petites mains at their disposal. And on the American side, Eleanor Lambert, as the official producer and coordinator for the American team, made her choices. They were the upstarts, the kings of ready-to-wear. There was Oscar de la Renta, the society charmer who, despite training in Paris, was now creating a uniquely American form of luxurious romantic sportswear, and Bill Blass, the epitome of uptown chic and master of the perfect cashmere coat. Then came the star, Halston, the king of the jet set, and Studio 54, a man as famous as his clients and the creator of the ultra-suede shirt dress. The great innovator Anne Klein was also chosen, though tragically ill with the cancer that would take her life just months later. So she sent her young, ambitious assistant to help, a 25-year-old named Donna Karan. The final wild card was Stephen Burrows, the only black designer, the youngest of the group, and the only one who represented the downtown energy of the disco scene with his vibrant, sexy jersey knits. This team did not have history. They had energy. They did not have government backing. They had a fraction of the budget. And they were, in the eyes of the French, glorified manufacturers. The stage was set for a public execution. The preparation was a disaster. The Americans arrived in Paris and were immediately treated as a second-class act. The rivalries and egos on their own team were almost fatal. Halston, as the biggest star, was in a constant state of war with the other designers. He demanded the best dressing room. He demanded to go last in the show. He was, by all accounts, throwing epic room-trashing tantrums. Bill Blass and Oscar de la Renta, who represented the old guard of American elegance, were horrified by the street clothes of Stephen Burrows. The team was on the verge of collapsing before they even stepped on the stage. Then came the rehearsal. The French, with their state-funded budgets, had built sets of breathtaking complexity. Marc Bohan had a full-sized pumpkin-shaped carriage. Pierre Cardin had a rocket ship. Givenchy had a flowered bower. Their presentation was a full-blown opera, and it took up all the rehearsal time. The Americans were pushed back and back and back until they were finally given the stage at 2 a.m., the night before the show, in a cold, dark, and unfamiliar theater. They were exhausted, demoralized, and completely unprepared. It was in this moment of total crisis that the American team found its footing. They looked at the French's massive, creaking, old-fashioned sets and made a decision born of pure necessity. They would have no sets. They would have a single, stark, black backdrop. They would have nothing but the clothes, the models, and the music. They also had a secret weapon, something the French, in their arrogance, had not even considered. Liza Minnelli. Fresh off her Oscar win for Cabaret and a close friend of Halston, she was the show's fairy godmother. Seeing the chaos, she and the choreographer Kay Thompson took charge, drilling the models and designers with a get-it-together Broadway-style professionalism. The Americans were not couturiers, they were entertainers. They would not try to beat the French at their game. They would change the game completely. But their real secret weapon, the one that would change history, was their models. The French were using their traditional pale-skinned aristocratic mannequins who were trained to walk in the slow, gliding couture style. The Americans, in a move of pure, unconscious genius, had brought a troupe of performers. And in a revolutionary move of the 36 models they brought, 10 were African American. This was not just a casting choice. It was a cultural statement. Women like Pat Cleveland, Bethan Hardison, Alva Chin, Amina Warsuma, and Billy Blair were not mannequins. They were personalities. They had attitude. They had rhythm. They knew how to sell a garment with their entire bodies. They were about to be unleashed on an audience that had never seen anything like them in their lives. On the night of November 28, 1973, the Royal Opera at Versailles was filled to capacity. The audience was a galaxy of 20th century power and fame. Princess Grace of Monaco, the Duchess of Windsor, Andy Warhol, Rudolf Nureyev, Josephine Baker, and it was an audience that was overwhelmingly patriotically pro-French. They had come to see the great masters and to be politely amused by the American upstarts. The French presentation came first, and it was exactly what everyone expected. It was a pageant. It was opulent. It was traditional. It was backed by a full symphony orchestra, and it was interminably long. For 2.5 hours, the audience sat as the elaborate creaking sets were rolled on and off. Zizi Jeanmaire performed a song. Rudolf Nureyev danced. Josephine Baker, in her 60s, was brought out of retirement to a wave of nostalgic applause. The clothes were beautiful, technical marvels of couture, but it was heavy. It was art as history, fashion as a museum piece. By the time it was over, the audience was exhausted, restless, and, quite frankly, a little bored. Then a pause. The stage was cleared. The elaborate sets were gone. A single stark black backdrop remained. The audience settled in for the little American show. A single spotlight hit the stage. A single voice, electric and unmistakable, cut through the silence. It was Liza Minnelli. "Bonjour, Paris," she belted out. It was a jolt of pure, unadulterated, caffeinated American energy. The show had begun. What followed was not a fashion show. It was a 35-minute cultural explosion. The orchestra was gone. In its place was a reel-to-reel tape deck, blasting a soundtrack of Al Green, Barry White, and Marvin Gaye. It was the sound of now. It was the sound of sex. And then came the models. They didn't glide. They didn't drift. They stomped. They stalked. They danced. They spun and twirled and brought a kinetic, joyful, and deeply sensual energy to the close. When Pat Cleveland, in a flowing rainbow-striped chiffon dress by Stephen Burrows, spun onto the stage like a human dervish, the audience audibly gasped. When Bethan Hardison, in another Burrows, stalked the runway, her hand on her hip, her chin up, radiating an attitude that was pure, unfiltered New York, the French were mesmerized. These were not women as passive hangers. These were women as protagonists. The clothes themselves were a revelation. They weren't stiff architectural sculptures. They were easy. Halston's bias-cut jersey dresses flowed over the models' bodies like water. Anne Klein's sportswear separates. Blazers, sweaters, skirts were chic, modern, and most shocking of all, interchangeable. Oscar de la Renta showed his gypsy-themed ruffles with a drama that matched the model's energy. Bill Blass showed the sleek, confident glamour that his swans adored. It was fashion as freedom. It was style as energy. The climax came with Liza, in a Halston pantsuit, leading the entire troupe of cheering, dancing models in a finale of cabaret. When the last model left the stage, there was a moment of stunned, absolute silence. The audience of 700 of the most jaded, sophisticated people on earth sat breathless, trying to process what they had just seen. They had come expecting a quaint folk art display. They had just witnessed a revolution. And then the silence broke. The entire opera house erupted. The audience was on its feet. They were cheering. They were stomping their feet. And they were, in the greatest of all European compliments, throwing their programs and even their souvenir program books into the air. It was a scene of pandemonium. Andy Warhol later said it was like a fashion show and a Broadway opening all in one. The French designers were, by all accounts, pale and shell-shocked. Yves Saint Laurent, a true genius, was said to have turned to the person next to him and said simply, "It is over." He knew exactly what had happened. The Americans had not just competed, they had won. They had won an unconditional, total, and landscape-altering victory. In the wings stood Eleanor Lambert, 70 years old. She was not a designer. She was not a model. She was not a muse. But this victory was hers. She had been the producer, the general, the strategist, the fundraiser, and the indomitable will that had held the entire chaotic enterprise together. She had just proven, on the most public stage in the world, the thesis of her entire life, that American fashion was not a trade. It was an art. It was not a copy. It was the future. The next day, the press proclaimed it a rout. The Battle of Versailles went down in history as the moment American fashion finally, decisively came of age. It was the moment that ready-to-wear proved itself not just the equal, but the superior of haute couture. It was the moment that the energy, diversity, and modern liberated woman of America conquered the old, historical, aristocratic fantasy of Paris. It was, in every sense, Eleanor Lambert's masterpiece. She had taken her army into the enemy's holiest sanctuary and burned it to the ground with a smile, a reel-to-reel tape deck, and a swirl of American chiffon. She had won her final war. The question now was, what does an empress do when all the wars are won? What happens after the greatest victory of your life? The night of November 28, 1973, was not an ending. It was a coronation. When the American designers, models, and their indomitable 70-year-old general, Eleanor Lambert, flew back from Paris, they were not returning as hopeful colonials. They were returning as conquering heroes. They had taken on the gods of haute couture in their own temple, and with a reel-to-reel tape deck and a cloud of chiffon, had proven that the future of fashion was not French. It was American. It was fast, it was easy, it was diverse, and it was, above all, a multi-billion-dollar business. The Battle of Versailles was the final deafening cannon shot in a war of cultural independence that Eleanor Lambert had personally declared more than 30 years earlier. She had won. The victory was total, public, and undeniable. In the years that followed, the entire dynamic of global fashion shifted. It was now the Parisian designers, particularly the young and brilliant ones like Karl Lagerfeld, who began to look to America, adopting the high-energy show format, embracing the concept of ready-to-wear, and understanding that the designer's personality was a key part of the brand. Lambert had not just won the battle. She had rewritten the rules of engagement for the entire world. For a lesser person, this moment would have been a perfect time to retire, to rest on laurels that were, by this point, monumental. She was 70. She was a widow. She had built her empire, and she had seen it victorious. She could have stepped back, becoming a grand dame, a venerated figurehead who spent her days at testimonial luncheons. But Eleanor Lambert was not a lesser person. She was not built for rest. She was a general who could not and would not leave the field. For her, the victory at Versailles was not a conclusion. It was a consolidation. Now that the empire was secure, her job was to govern it, to strengthen its borders, and to ensure its legacy would be permanent. She was about to enter the final, longest, and most complex phase of her life, the reign of the establishment monarch. The 1970s and 1980s saw the world that Lambert had created become the status quo. Her institutions were no longer revolutionary, they were the establishment, and her primary fortress, the Council of Fashion Designers of America, now entered its golden age. With the victory at Versailles, membership in the CFDA became the ultimate mark of success. It was the American Academy, and Lambert, as its founder and executive director, was its permanent chancellor. It was from this seat of power that she executed one of her most brilliant and final institutional maneuvers. For decades, her Coty Awards had been the industry's Oscars, but they were sponsored by a private corporation, Coty. This was a vulnerability. It meant the industry's highest honor was, in effect, beholden to a corporate checkbook. In the 1980s, Lambert, through the CFDA, made her move. The CFDA would absorb the awards, rebrand them, and make them its own. The Coty Awards were phased out, and in their place, the CFDA Fashion Awards were born. This was a masterstroke of bureaucratic genius. She had transferred the immense prestige of the Winnie statuette, prestige she herself had built over 40 years, to a new award that was now owned and controlled by the industry itself. An industry, of course, that was governed by the organization she had founded, and she still effectively ran. She had successfully laundered her personal dictatorial power into a permanent democratic institution. She had made her influence immortal by dissolving it into the very DNA of the industry. The CFDA Awards, to this day, remain the definitive American fashion honor. It was one of her last and most lasting acts of architectural genius. She continued to preside over her other domains with an iron hand. New York Fashion Week was the engine, and the best-dressed list remained her personal private kingdom. But this kingdom, the very high society world of swans that she had helped create, was about to be rocked by a betrayal so public and so savage that it would mark the end of an era. Eleanor Lambert's power system had always been a triangle: the designers, the press, and the socialites. The socialites, her swans, were the key. They were the women who gave the clothes a context, a life. They were the fantasy. Women like Babe Paley, Slim Keith, Gloria Guinness, C.Z. Guest. These were her paragons of taste. And the high priest of this cult of swans was the brilliant, bitchy, and utterly charming writer, Truman Capote. He was their friend, their confidant, their court jester. He traveled on their yachts. He stayed in their guest houses, and he listened to all of their secrets. And in 1975, he did the unthinkable. He published them. His story, La Côte Basque, 1965, which appeared in Esquire magazine, was a thinly veiled, absolutely brutal expose of his friends. He laid bare their husbands' infidelities, their petty cruelties, their darkest, most private humiliations. The story was a social atom bomb. It destroyed friendships, it ended his own social career, and most importantly, it killed the very world it was describing. It shattered the illusion of effortless, correct elegance that Lambert had spent her life promoting. It revealed that behind the facade of the best-dressed list was a world of pain, adultery, and vicious gossip. Babe Paley, Lambert's ultimate icon, was said to have been personally devastated by the betrayal and never spoke to Capote again. This event, which seems like a mere society scandal, was a profound threat to Lambert's power structure. The very goddesses she had placed on the pedestal were now seen as tragic, flawed, and even slightly ridiculous figures. The entire concept of good taste, as defined by this tiny, closed circle of wealthy wives, was suddenly rendered obsolete. A new world was rising, a world of celebrity rather than society. It was the age of Studio 54, of Andy Warhol, of pop stars and movie stars who had fame and influence that dwarfed the ladies who lunch. Eleanor Lambert, now in her 70s, was once again at a crossroads. Was her best-dressed list, the ultimate symbol of her power, now a joke? Would she go down with the swans? Once again, the pragmatist from Indiana trumped the Park Avenue snob. Lambert did not fight the change, she adapted. She was a student of power, and she could see where the power was moving. If the world was now obsessed with movie stars and musicians, so be it. She would anoint them. The list, under her continued careful curation, began to change. Alongside the requisite princesses and billionaires, new names appeared: Cher, Diana, Ross, Madonna, Princess Diana, who became the list's new global icon. She was not abandoning her principles. She was simply following the power. She understood that the function of the list was to identify the people the world wanted to watch and then link them to the fashion she wanted to promote. If that person was no longer Babe Paley, but, heaven help her, a pop star in a cone bra, she would hold her nose and write the name down. This flexibility, this refusal to become a relic, is what kept her and her institutions relevant for another 3 decades, long after the world of the Swans had crumbled to dust. Her life in the 1980s and 1990s settled into a formidable routine. She was now a legend, a living monument. She was Mrs. Lambert, a title spoken with a mixture of terror and reverence. She never retired. She never even slowed down. She was in her office every day well into her 90s. She would arrive wrapped in a turban and a cloud of Balmain's Jolie Madame perfume and get on the phone. Her voice still sharp, her demands still absolute. She had outlived all her rivals. Diana Vreeland, her great partner and foil, died in 1989. The designers she had first championed, Norelle McCardle, were long gone. Even the next generation, like Halston, had passed away, a tragic victim of the AIDS crisis. But Eleanor endured. She was the industry's living memory, its permanent, unmovable matriarch. Her private life remained just that, private. Her son, Bill Berkson, the avant-garde poet, was a constant, steady presence, a connection to a world of art and intellect that was her true bedrock. Her relationship with him was the quiet counterpoint to her noisy public life. He was the one part of her world that was not about commerce or power, but about pure creativity. It was the part of her that had started in the galleries, the part that truly did believe her designers were artists. She was the woman who would go to a raucous, chaotic CFDA award show she had produced, and then go home and read a book of experimental poetry her son had published. It was this deep, unresolvable, and fruitful contradiction that made her who she was. She was a holy terror. She was a bulldozer. She was a visionary. And she was still in her 90s publishing the best-dressed list. She was still granting interviews. Her mind sharp as a diamond. Her opinions delivered like royal decrees. She had become a beloved monster, a woman who had earned the right to be as difficult and demanding as she wanted, because every single person in the industry knew on some level that they owed their jobs to her. But time, in the end, is the one rival no one can outmaneuver. And the final great tragedy of Eleanor Lambert's life was not a death or a betrayal. It was the inevitable consequence of her own total success. The empire she had built was, by the 1990s, simply too vast, too complex, and too powerful to be ruled by a single, aging monarch. Her babies had grown up, and they no longer needed her day-to-day care. New York Fashion Week, her first great invention, was a victim of its own success. By the late 80s, it had degenerated into the very chaos she had originally sought to fix. With no central venue, editors and buyers spent a frantic week racing in taxis all over Manhattan, from a showroom in a garment district high-rise to a freezing cold warehouse on the West Side piers. It was unmanageable. In 1993, a younger new generation, led by the CFDA's executive director Fern Mallis, finally re-centralized it. They created 7th on 6th, the famous white tents in Bryant Park. It was a brilliant, necessary move that professionalized Fashion Week for a new era. It was, in effect, someone redoing exactly what Lambert had done in 1943. But in this new narrative, Lambert, the founder, was increasingly referred to as a pioneer, a historical figure. The new generation was now running the show. The Met Gala, Her other great invention was also undergoing a transformation. After Diana Vreeland's death, the event needed a new champion. It found one in the newly installed editor-in-chief of Vogue, Anna Wintour. Wintour saw the potential of the event that Lambert and Vreeland had created, and, with her unparalleled access to celebrity and corporate sponsorship, she would fuse the gala with the power of Vogue, transforming it from a New York society benefit into the global billion-dollar spectacle of power it is today. Anna Wintour's Met Gala. Eleanor Lambert, the woman who had founded the event and run it for decades, was gently, respectfully, and completely pushed to the side. The CFDA, her fortress, was now a mature, self-sustaining government. It was run by a series of powerful presidents: Oscar de la Renta, Bill Blass, Stan Herman. Lambert was given the lifetime honorary title of Executive Director Emeritus. But the daily power was in other hands. Her creations had become, as she had always intended, bigger than her. They were institutions, and institutions by their nature have no memory. They are only loyal to their own survival. Eleanor Lambert died on October 7th, 2003, at the age of 100. She had worked, quite literally, until the end. She had published her final best-dressed list just a few weeks before. She had lived an entire century. She had seen the world change from horse-drawn carriages to the internet. And she had, in her own way, been as responsible for the shape of that century as any president or general. But her death revealed the central irony of her life. The city she had built was so magnificent, the lights so bright, the music so loud, that the architect had become invisible. The world she left behind was a world where New York Fashion Week was a global brand, where the Met Gala was the party of the year, and where American star designers were household names. It was the very world she had dreamed of. And it was a world that, within a few short years of her death, would almost completely forget her name. Eleanor Lambert's death at the age of 100 was the final quiet closing of a door on a century she had, in so many ways, defined. She had outlived her friends, her rivals, her king-making husband, and even many of the brilliant star-like designers she had catapulted to fame. She was a relic from another age, a living monument to a world that was gone, a woman who had single-handedly built the glittering, high-stakes, multi-billion-dollar industry we now call fashion. And then she was gone. And the silence that followed was perhaps the most telling part of her story. There were obituaries, of course, respectful and full of astonished statistics, but the vast global machine she had built barely sputtered. It did not pause, it did not slow down. New York Fashion Week was just weeks away, and the machine, now run by a new generation of producers, designers, and, most of all, a new empress at Vogue, was gearing up for the next season. The Met Gala, her society party, was already on its way to becoming the global Super Bowl of celebrity that it is today. The CFDA, her fortress, was a self-sustaining government. This is the great final and most profound irony of Eleanor Lambert's life. Her legacy is not a statue in a park or a name on a building. Her legacy is the very air the modern fashion world breathes. It is the system itself, and the system was so perfectly designed, so strong and so total, that it not only survived her death, it completely absorbed her memory. She was the ghost in her own machine. To understand her significance, you must understand that almost every single aspect of the fashion world we take for granted today was an idea that she invented or perfected from scratch. When you see a headline about New York Fashion Week and see the thousands of editors, buyers, and influencers descending on Manhattan, you are witnessing the direct descendant of the desperate, patriotic press week she willed into existence in 1943. She was the one who first had the audacious idea to put American designers on a single stage and force the world to look at them. When you watch a young unknown designer, perhaps an immigrant or a kid from the suburbs, win a CFDA award, and overnight see their orders explode and their name become a brand, you are witnessing the power of the star-making machine she designed. She was the one who understood that designers needed to be artists, not just tradesmen, and that artists needed awards to be canonized. When you watch the almost religious spectacle of the Met Gala, as the entire world stops to watch movie stars, pop singers, and tech billionaires ascend the steps of the museum, you are watching the ultimate expression of her life's thesis, that fashion, art, celebrity, and money are an indivisible quadrangle of power. She co-founded the event, and her rival, Diana Vreeland, gave it its fantasy. But it was Anna Wintour who looked at the template they had created and turned it into a global weapon of influence. And when you read a list, any list of the best-dressed celebrities, when you follow an influencer on Instagram, when you participate in the great global theater of who is wearing what, you are playing a game for which Eleanor Lambert wrote the original rules. She was the one who understood before anyone else that the woman who wears the clothes is just as important, if not more so, than the man who designs them. She turned style from a private hobby into a public, competitive, and hugely commercial sport. She took a trade and made it an industry. She took dressmakers and made them celebrities. She took a colonial outpost, New York, and made it an empire. She was the architect who designed the city, laid the foundations, built the institutions, and then, for more than half a century, ran the entire infrastructure. She was the ultimate pragmatist, a Midwesterner who saw that art was just a product until it was sold, and that the best way to sell it was to wrap it in glamour, personality, and snobbery. In the end, how do we remember a woman who built a city that is now so vast we can no longer see its foundations? We remember her as a pioneer, yes, but that word is too small, too quaint. It suggests a woman in a log cabin, not an empress in a Park Avenue apartment. Eleanor Lambert's story is a profound and perhaps a slightly chilling lesson in the nature of power. It is a story that proves that the most lasting power is not wielded by the person on the throne, but by the person who built the throne, who designed the room it sits in, and who writes the guest list for the coronation. She was the producer, the publicist, the strategist, the creator. She was the indispensable, invisible hand that guided American fashion from a clumsy, insecure infancy to a ruthless, global maturity.